Shana Tova, everyone. It's so good to be with you, even in this very strange way. Look, there's two ways to look at this. One is, it's been a terrible year, a difficult year, and this isn't what we want. I want to be able to be with you and see you and hug you, and we can't do that. Some of you are able to do it, and God bless you, and others are streaming, and there's really one important point, and that is we're together. Everything else just doesn't matter. So, pray with me first. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, God of our fathers and our mothers before us, heal us this year, heal the world this year, and help us to come together next Yontif, face to face. And let us say Amen. So today, on this Yontif, we continue our spiritual exploration, our multi-year exploration of the clay Kodesh, the holy objects that were on the Temple Mount. 3 years ago, I taught you about the Mishkan, the Ark of the Covenant, which, as you know, was discovered by Indiana Jones and Steven Spielberg, who put it, I think, in his beach house. And that contained the second copy of the Ten Commandments, and we also discovered the broken pieces of the first set of commandments, Aaron's staff, and a clay jug filled with manna, which most people don't know about. 2 years ago, we studied about the menorah, which is the 7-branched candelabrum that was taken by the Romans after their conquest of Jerusalem. We see it on the Arch of Titus in Rome, and it disappeared into Rome, but it's also now in Steven Spielberg's beach house. And last year, we considered the kior, the wash basin of the priests, made of mirrors taken from the women in Egypt. And that, I think, is just outside Steven Spielberg's beach house. And this year, we're on to a new object, really the most important of all the objects, and that's the Mizbeach, the altar, upon which the burnt offerings of animals were offered. The Mizbeach is arguably, and I would defend the proposition, that it was the most important object in all of biblical Judaism. All the other holy objects on the Temple Mount were either spiritual decorations, like the menorah. It had no purpose other than being a decoration, or they were spiritual relics, like the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaKodesh. The altar, the Mizbeach, was different. The Mizbeach was a spiritual tool. The altar was the device that made all of biblical Judaism work. To be biblically Jewish, let's just remember this, one had to offer animal sacrifices. And the altar was the place where the sacrifices were offered. After the year 621 of the Common Era, King Josiah closed down all the other temples in Israel, in the land of Israel, except for the altar on the Temple Mount. And it was the place where 3 times a year, on Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos, thousands of Jews made pilgrimage to Jerusalem to affirm their Jewishness by bringing sacrifices of animals and grain and fruits. On Passover, on Pesach, lambs were slaughtered for the Passover meal. And at that time, there were thousands of people on the hillsides around Jerusalem. They said that the temple which had drain spigots, was just bleeding the blood of lambs into the valley. The altar sustained the priesthood, and the priesthood sustained Judaism. Jewish priests from the tribe of Levi, Kohen, Levi, the Jewish priests ate the meat from the sacrifices, which was called truma, and they burned to ash only the skin and the innards, which were not edible. The altar was the engine that made Judaism work. Now, what did the altar look like? Well, we have the description in Exodus 27, verses 1 to 8. You shall make the altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits broad. The altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. And you shall make horns for it on its 4 corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay it all with bronze. You shall make pots for it to receive the ashes, and shovels and basins and forks and fire pans. And you shall make all its utensils of bronze. And you shall also make for it a grating, a network of bronze. And on the net you shall make 4 bronze rings at 4 corners, and you shall set it under the ledge on the altar, so that the net extends halfway down the altar. Okay, so what does this mean? What did the Mizbeach look like? Well, a cubit is a linear measure, basically from your chest to your outstretched arm. It's the way rope was measured. That's 1 cubit, 2 cubits, about 3 feet. So the altar was basically 15 feet by 15 feet square and 9 feet tall. It was wood, but it was covered with bronze, so obviously it wouldn't burn up. And it had a lower grate to hold the wood, which was burning, and the upper grate to hold the animals, which were burned. Perhaps the best way to visualize the altar of sacrifice was to think of it as the largest and most sacred Weber barbecue grill ever made. Only animals were sacrificed on the Mizbeach HaOlah. There was another altar on the temple mound in the temple. It was called the Mizbeach HaKetoret, and that was the altar that was used to burn up incense. In the Judaism that we read about in the Torah, let's get this straight. It ran on sacrifices. It did not run on prayers. The Torah has no prayers in it. There's one exception, where Moses prays for Miriam, who got leprosy, and he prays, El Na Rafana La, God healed her. But other than that prayer, there's no prayers in the Torah. It had sacrifices. It had no Passover Seder. It had a Passover sacrifice. I think they did have brisket, but the priests ate the brisket, so it was like it wasn't there anyway. Almost a third of the entire Torah is devoted to the laws of sacrifice, which have been abandoned for 2,000 years. We spend every week and 2/3 of the Torah reading about laws that have been gone for 2,000 years. When the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, they basically destroyed all of that, all of biblical Judaism. You need to understand that. It was really almost like a totally different religion. And if it were not for a group of spiritual geniuses called rabbis who gathered at the first yeshiva in a place called Yavne, which is just off runway 1B in the airport now in Lod, that yeshiva was the first place that a new Judaism was created by the head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who asked the Emperor Titus, well, he wasn't an emperor yet, he was just a general, but he asked Titus, while the temple was still burning, Tein li Yavne v'chachamel, please give me Yavne and its wise men And that gift from Titus, that gift from a Roman general, was the gift that ensured the creation of a new Judaism, rabbinic Judaism. And it is the Judaism we know today, with the addition of organ music and bar mitzvah parties. But basically, they are the ones who invented everything. The key move of rabbinic Judaism was the substitution of animal sacrifices with prayers. The morning sacrifice, the shacharit, was replaced by the morning shacharit prayer. The afternoon grain offering, the mincha, was replaced by the afternoon mincha prayer. The additional holiday sacrifice, the musaf, was replaced by an additional musaf prayer in the new prayer books, which were also new. The rabbis wrote all of them. They wrote the Siddur, the daily prayer book, and the Machzor, the high holiday prayer book. And of course, it was the rabbis who replaced the priests. Their spiritual creativity, recorded in the books we should be studying, the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, filled the gigantic hole in Judaism, created by the destruction of the temple and the eradication of the priesthood and animal sacrifices in Judaism. Of course, rabbinic Judaism is not completely different from biblical Judaism. The ethical commandments are the same. Lo tirtzach, you shouldn't murder. Lo tarog, lo tamod al dam re'echa, you shouldn't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. All the ethical commandments are the same. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. They're all the same. The holidays have the same name, but what we do on the holidays is not at all the same. Biblical Pesach involved eating a lamb, which must be sacrificed by a local priest. Rabbinic Pesach involved eating brisket, which must, as you all know, must be ordered from a local caterer. The Roman armies of Titus ended the argument over sacrificing animals. It was over when the Romans destroyed the temple. But the truth about sacrifice you must know, and that is centuries, really 8 centuries before the destruction of the temple, there was a revolution within Judaism against animal sacrifice. And that revolution was led by the prophets. The prophet Hosea, for example, spoke for his vision of God. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Hosea chapter 6. The prophet Samuel had the same anti-sacrificial belief. Samuel said, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? The answer there is no, by the way. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. And most powerfully, most eloquently, there is Isaiah's critique of sacrifices. Isaiah didn't mince words. In Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 to 17, I am sick of your sacrifices. Don't bring me any more of them. I don't want your fat rams. I don't want to see the blood from your offerings. Who wants your sacrifices when you have no sorrow for your sins? The incense you bring to me is a stench in my nostrils. Your holy celebrations of the new moon and the Sabbath and your special days for fasting, even your most pious meetings, they are all frauds. I want nothing more to do with them. I hate them all. I can't stand the sight of them. Oh, wash yourselves. Be clean. Let me no longer see you doing all these wicked things. Quit your evil ways. Learn to do good, to be fair, and to help the poor, the fatherless, and the widows. Isaiah was not given to understatement. Although the altar was destroyed in the first century, its meaning was destroyed centuries before. A hereditary priesthood filled with notoriously corrupt high priests was not loved by the people, nor should it have been. Torturing animals, slaughtering them, burning them up, all of that, thankfully and finally, yielded control over Judaism to a meritocracy of rabbis. Not like the priesthood, which was inherited. Your father had to be a priest for you to be a priest. The rabbis, it was whoever was smart became a rabbi. Whoever was worthy became a rabbi. And the priests, well, they kind of lost their grip on Judaism, lost their hold on it. It was a tough time. The rabbis did try in their way to console the priests, the Jews who were descended from the priestly families. They relegated the first two aliyot in reading the Torah in a traditional synagogue to Kohanes first and Levi second. Priests can officiate, and only priests can officiate at the Pidyon Haben ceremonies, the redemption of the firstborn male offspring. They bless the congregation on holy days, and I used to fill in for them. I miss that. And they give families named Cohen and Levi something to brag about. But basically, that was it for the priesthood. All good, you say all good, good, good. Rabbinic Judaism comes in, changes it all. No burning animals, no mizbeach, no temple. Okay. Well, here's my twist this year. I'm going to defend biblical Judaism. Okay? I'm going to defend some elements of the burning up of animals that we have abandoned. And I'm going to do that. Look, nothing up my sleeves. Here it is. Here it comes. I believe, and I will argue today, that when we threw out the bathwater of biblical Judaism and its animal sacrifices, we also threw out a baby. And that baby is the spiritual value of sacrifice. My argument is that when biblical Judaism died, sacrificial Judaism also died. And we need to recover the value of sacrifice if Judaism is to survive into the diaspora for another 2,000 years. I would take it year by year, frankly. Professor Gary Stroosma writes in his book, The End of Sacrifice, when the temple fell, he says, Judaism became the first people who maintained a sustained existence without sacrifice. And I believe he's right. Sacrifice plays a very major role in Christianity and in Islam, and in Hinduism as well. But a Judaism that does not teach the value of sacrifice, I believe, is doomed. The rabbis knew this. The rabbis knew this. And they tried to import and transform the sacrificial elements of biblical Judaism into rabbinic Judaism, without, of course, including burning carcasses. We all agree Burning carcasses is a line we want to draw. Not going beyond the line of burning carcasses. Their task and their vision of a sacrificial Judaism must now be our sacred task. The problem that the rabbis faced is obvious, my friends. Offering up an animal sacrifice, just think of that. Offering up an animal sacrifice is a powerful act, it's a costly act, and it's an unambiguous act. You give something of great value, and it's offered up with great ceremony for God. Compare that, please, to the rabbinic version of asking you to turn to page 615 and rise as we recite the Aleinu. It's just not the same. A spoken prayer does not have the same optics or power as a burning animal. That is the problem with rabbinic Judaism, and particularly Reform Judaism. It asks too little of us, but we can respond by offering more. The first step in making prayer truly sacrificial is understanding Hebrew. That is absolutely step number one. We cannot affirm prayers written in a language we do not understand. Praying in the vernacular, which was one of the inventions of Reform Judaism, is easy, it's helpful, and it is precisely why we authentically pray in Hebrew. Hebrew is the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, and it is the language we have set apart from all other languages to speak to God. This is why Hasidim speak Yiddish and not Hebrew outside the prayer service. Hebrew is a sacrificial gift that must not be used for daily affairs. Now, the rise of Zionism changed all this in its revival of Hebrew as a spoken language. But for us in the diaspora, Hebrew is a key to coming close to God. And a side benefit of learning Hebrew is it is also the key to ordering a falafel on Ben Yehuda Street. Another change that will help restore a full and rich and thick and life-giving sacrificial Judaism to our lives is to meiser ourselves. In Judaism, the meiser, which comes from the Hebrew meaning 1/10, maaser, is the practice of giving away 1/10 of your gross income. 1/10 of your gross income. The meiser is the rabbinic attempt to preserve the biblical practice of giving 1/10 of everything to the priests. You may know this as the rabbinic concept of tzedakah, but the meiser is the proper content of tzedakah. So let me ask you, just privately, do a quick calculation about your charitable giving and see if you are close to giving away 1/10 of everything you make. Gross, not net. So deep is the practice of meisering oneself in Orthodox Judaism that the early rabbis of the Talmud actually had to pass a takanah, a rabbinic ordinance, that a Jew is not allowed to give away more than 1/3 of his or her income annually. Now just let that wash around in your brain a little. You understand this? We are the descendants of Jews who had to be restrained from giving away too much and thus depriving our families of the necessities of life. I, for one, am deeply proud to be descended from Jews who had to be ordered not to sacrifice too much. Another biblical commandment for sacrifice that the rabbis tried to instill into rabbinic Judaism is the Shemitah. The Shemitah is the 7th year in the growing cycle, where nothing is planted and the land lies fallow. Anything that grows in the Shemitah year is given to the poor. Also, all debts are canceled in the Shemitah year. The Shemitah is an entire year of sacrifice. And according to rabbinic calculations, this year, the year that begins today, is a Shemitah year. So let us try to link our sacrifices to those of our ancestors. Let us try to find ways to forgive our debts, the debts that others hold for us and from us, and to give away what we might on an ordinary year hoard for ourselves. The most impressive work of the rabbis in preserving biblical Judaism's sacrificial core was manifested in the actual day-to-day lives of the Jews who lived in a million Anatevkas, in the shtetls of Eastern Europe. There, the highest status person in the community was the Baal Tzedakah. The Baal Tzedakah. They were the most respected people, and they were the people who made sacrificial giving their deepest passion. The Rishnitzer Rebbe was a famous Baal Tzedakah. His only possession of value, as it was recorded by his students, was a silver Kiddush cup. That is all he owned. Every Thursday, he would pawn his Kiddush cup and give the money to a family who could not buy food for Shabbat and have an Oneg Shabbat. Then, every Friday, a group of merchants would go to the pawnbroker and buy back the Rebbe's Kiddush cup and return it to him before Shabbat so he could make Kiddush. These are our ancestors. These are the ones who preserved sacrificial Judaism and bequeathed it to us. And the Rishnitzer was not the only one who practiced sacrificial Judaism. One of the most sad but also inspiring tasks I had over the almost 40 years that I was with you in that way was burying people, many of them your bubbies and zadis, and your parents, and your family, who absolutely understood the meaning of sacrificial Judaism. I buried a man whose grandfather rented on the Lower East Side a coal bin as his apartment, so he could save his wages and bring his family over from Russia. I buried a woman who never ate any part of the chicken except the wing. She did this because as a child, she saw her mother do it. She would only eat the wings so that the family could all have a better place at the table near the chicken, and one single roast chicken would feed an entire family for Shabbat. I buried a woman, this was an amazing story, who saw her mother go to the baker, the village baker in the shtetl, with her pot for cholent, which is a pot full of beans and onions and some meat. And it's baked over a long period of time, from Friday afternoon, and it's eaten on Shabbos afternoon because you can't light a fire. So it was put into the ovens that was used to make Shabbos challahs, but the ovens were still warm, so they would cook the cholent over the evening. But she would bring an extra pot to the baker for a poor family to have cholent. A poor family she never met. They would come and collect it for Shabbat. They would clean the pot and return it to the baker, where her mother would retrieve it and fill it for the next Shabbat. I buried a woman who was an elderly woman when she died, and she never bought a dress. Her husband, a tailor, would save scraps of cloth from his work, and he would sew dresses for his wife. I buried a woman whose husband was stricken with Alzheimer's, and so he could not drive safely. To protect his dignity, she drove him to work and picked him up every day for 20 years. Doing this, making this sacrifice, prevented her from working or traveling or having a normal social life. It was a daily sacrifice of love for her. That woman was my mother. All these little acts of tzedakah preserved a great sacrificial faith and bequeathed it to us. And what have we done with that faith? Where are the Baalei tzedakah in the new generations? In Gen X, in the millennials? Sacrificial Judaism is in deep trouble. 90% of UJA gifts now come from less than 10% of the givers, and the majority of them are over 65. Synagogue membership and giving are down. APAC giving is down. Jewish organizations like the AJC, ADL, and Hadassah are struggling. All synagogues are struggling. At a time of great financial peril, I am so proud that our synagogue has chosen to let our members decide for themselves how much they will donate to our Kehilat Kodesh, our holy congregation. It is not just the future of Temple Beth Torah that's at stake. It is the future of sacrificial Judaism. The burning altar on the Temple Mount is gone, but the altar of sacrifice for our faith must still burn in our hearts. We are the altar upon which the fires of the future of Judaism will be offered up or allowed to become extinguished. It is our choice. We must revive the Judaism that burned up animals on the altar and fed the priesthood. And we must do it without the altar, without the animals, and without the priests. We must do it by resolving that what it means to be Jewish is to bring a gift from our life to God for the people Israel. And this is why God accepted the very first sacrifice, the sacrifice of Abel. Abel brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock, while Cain just brought some of the discarded fruit from his fields. God accepted Abel's sacrifice because he sacrificed his best. The great runner Steve Prefontaine said, "To give anything less than your best is to sacrifice the gift." Finally, we must learn that true sacrifice must extend to our community, our nation, and our world. I preached this sermon because all of us have just lived through an incredible year of sacrifice. This year asked each of us to sacrifice in ways we could have never imagined before. Margaret Renkel, writing about the pandemic, about the coronavirus in the New York Times, wrote, "This national calamity, this invasion by a destructive and unstoppable force was our chance to come together across every possible division. We could finally remember how to sacrifice on behalf of our fellow Americans, how to mourn together the unfathomable losses, not just of life, but of security, camaraderie, and the capacity for hope. Plenty of Americans, essential workers, first responders, hospital staff, teachers, and many others, lost their lives because they made such sacrifices. Millions more complied unhesitatingly with measures designed to keep the most vulnerable among us safe. But too many of us did not. Too many were hostile to the very idea that they should alter their behavior, even in the smallest way, for the sake of strangers. I agree. Getting vaccinated and wearing a mask is a small sacrifice for fellow Americans whose names we will never know. It is an act of patriotism, and patriotism is an act of sacrifice and love. And while I speak of sacrificial patriotism, let me ask you to pray with me now for all the soldiers who sacrificed life and limb and mental health in the war in Afghanistan. Some of our allies are still trapped there, and we must not sleep easily until they are brought out to freedom. The sacrifices of that war are more terrible than we will ever know. For 20 years, an entire country became a burning altar. While many Americans lost their willingness to sacrifice, our brave soldiers understood sacrifices in ways that we cannot comprehend. The offerings of the altar were called korbanot, from the Hebrew root karav, which means to come close. A korban means a thing offered to God that brought you near to God. The altar was once the place where we came close to God. Remembering the meaning of the altar may yet help God come close to us in our time of grief and pain and need. In the words of Psalm 43, verses 3 and 4, "Send forth your light and your truth. They will lead me. They will bring me to your holy mountain, to your dwelling place, that I may come to the altar of God, my delight, my joy, that I may praise you with the stringed instrument. O God, my God, Elohai Elohim." This is the secret of sacrificial Judaism. It teaches us that the way to God is not through words, but through actions. Through acts of sacrifice in which we set aside our own self-interest for a power higher than ourselves. Sacrifices are a mutual claiming. We claim God and God claims us in the sacrifice. God says that we are an Am Segulah, a chosen and beloved people, and we say two words that will light every altar. Every altar. In every city and town and nation. Elohim Elohai. O God, my God. Elohim Elohai. O God.